I don't know if you can see this so well. Can you turn off the light? So it's a great honor to be here for my second talk. I very much look forward to our discussion. I want to qualify my talk by saying there are many people who have spent many years studying the history of Seoul in great detail, and I know already, I'm not talking about it, I'm sorry, I want to first give a qualification to my talk that there are several people in the audience I know already who have a much more profound knowledge of the history of Seoul than I do. So I look forward to hearing from everybody about some of the issues that I raised. This is essentially based on a book in Korean about the city of Seoul and its culture, which I finished, in fact, but which is still unpublished because of various disagreements with the publisher. But the title, A Tale of Two Cities, that's the title of the book. And the second I put on just for fun was Seoul as Byzantium. So in fact, Tale of Two Cities is intended in two different senses of the word. The first sense is the fun sense. So I was very interested in the city of Seoul. I've been here for a while, and particularly its geopolitical significance. Because one of the funny things you notice about Korea is always in a state of flux and crisis, and things are getting worse and worse. But in fact, if you stay here for a few years, you will notice that in fact things get better and better in Korea, in spite of the fact that it always looks terrible. And the city of Seoul is perhaps the most outstanding in that respect, which has gone, even in the short time I've lived here, has increasingly become one of the most important cities, I think now, increasingly in the world. And so when I looked at Seoul over the last few years, I started the one sense of the Tale of Two Cities was I kept thinking about the Roman Empire. I'm an American, by the way. In fact, I came from Washington, D.C. to Seoul, or to Korea. And so I always thought about Washington, D.C. and Seoul in the same sort of, somehow related in my mind. So I often tend to think about the Roman Empire, as you probably remember, as Rome increasingly was run by its outstanding leaders like Caligula. The city became increasingly non-functional, and the empire started to fall apart. But in fact, the Roman Empire did not fall. In some sense, it was only the beginning, because a new city emerged, which was Byzantium, which is now Constantinople. And this was a new center, which in fact would last for many hundreds of years longer, and in some respects reached new heights that Rome had not ever reached, and a more greater sophistication in some respects. And so when I thought about, in the American system, of course, Washington, D.C. being the other parallel, as Washington, D.C., I will not tell you what's going on there, but I'll leave it to your imagination. The question was, as Asia rose, which city would become the sort of global system, the most central city? And I personally think Seoul is a pretty good bet. That, of course, there are other cities like Shanghai and Beijing, which are nice if you are not intending to live very long. And Tokyo is a nice place if you're over 70 years old. But in fact, Seoul, having lived, by the way, I haven't lived in Beijing for a long period of time, but I lived in Tokyo for more than 6 years. And I think Seoul has this sort of animation, this cultural animation. People are trying to do things, don't always do it well, but they're constantly trying, and it has a sort of a vibrancy. And also, like Byzantium, which I never lived in the 6th century, but I can imagine increasingly the types of people who come to Seoul are more and more sophisticated and more complex. You get, theater and art and all sorts of things in a way you really don't find anywhere else. So that's the first. But I'm going to talk about a different. So that's the first two cities. The second one, when I say the two cities, Tale of Two Cities, I'm talking about within the city of Seoul itself. I've tended to feel that it's a city in a way, it's two cities occupying the same geographical space, and they seem to be in some sort of like constant tussle. And that what makes, my argument in my book, was that what makes Seoul a vibrant cultural environment is this tension between these two different cities that inhabit the same space. So we go back to the founding of the Chosun and Seoul as a capital under Lee. Of course, there's a very long and interesting story about how he set out to try and find his capital and how he was helped in this process by various figures. The most famous, the beginning of the Tale of Two Cities, these two concepts of what Seoul could be, I think you can trace back to the discussion between the two advisors to the founder, Lee Sung-gae, Muhak, the monk, and Jung Do-jun, well, the bureaucrat, maybe not a polite term, but his main political advisor. And these two individuals had very different views about what sort of a city Seoul would be. And there really was very little here. So they started to, I wouldn't say from scratch, but they planned it out in big strokes. So the differences were, Muhak was more interested in sort of the energy of the land itself, the spiritual power within the land, and in fact, they picked two different mountains, right? Muhak took Inhwangsan as his sort of the key for the city that he imagined because of its spiritual energy, and it was, of course, somewhat somewhat spontaneous and, of course, Buddhist. It had these many Buddhist shrines and temples there, so it had great power for him. He was a Buddhist. Right? Chung Do-jun was a Confucian, and he took Daksan and the north-south axis. He wanted to set up a capital essentially on the model of Chang'an from the Tang, or Gwangju, of course, from the Shilla, north-south, perfect axis, and to build the palace of Gangbuk following that trajectory. So it was a very Confucian world that he wanted to lay out with straight boulevards at right angles and a very formalistic structure. So I would suggest, and of course this is just a flight of fancy, but to some degree these two sort of paradigms for what the city could be from the very beginning continue down. They have their own lineages down to the present day. So what happened afterwards? So of course, in many respects, of course, Muhak was successful in terms of the general sense of where this capital would be established, but it was Chung Do-jun who actually ran things and did the building of the boulevards and the laying out for the Gangbuk palace. And so ultimately, as you know, the Chosun was much more, in fact, perhaps almost unique in Asian history in the degree to which Confucianism was the central ideology. And so things were very strict in the way that the city was planned out. But I think something of what had existed before, of course, lingered on. So afterwards, Chung Do-jun, of course, killed by Lee Bang-won, the next generation, who then became king and tried to move back to Kaesong, go back a little bit to the colonial period. And in the next generation, King Daejeon came back to Seoul. But when he came back, he built another palace, the Changdok Palace, which is, again, arranged in a slightly different way. I mean, the Gangbuk is much more straightforward Confucian on a clear axis. Changdok is somewhat more complex structure and arrangement, not so straight. It has a sort of a complex path you have to follow to enter it. And in fact, Seoul is somewhat unique in the way it has these different palaces. Different kings lived in different palaces, and they had different connotations. I think in the case of Gangbuk Palace to some degree. The bloodshed in the Gangbuk Palace in the previous generation maybe discouraged people from going there. There's maybe an incentive to start a new palace. And as you probably know, the Gangbuk Palace itself was in ruins for many, many years, of course, after the Japanese invasions. The city was laid out with the future, and some people would say with a Chungnam shrine. In fact, that the founders essentially planned for the entire dynasty. There was a space for each king to the very end, almost perfectly, and there was a sort of a vision for what the city would be. And that, of course, we see in Korea today. If you go to Songdo or Daejeon City, Koreans like starting out from nothing and starting a new city. So that's actually not totally new. I mean, Seoul was in a way a Shindoshi, as we said in Korean at the beginning. The ancient shrines aside, the chief altars for the crops, for the land, established at that time in a very orderly Confucian world. There's an advertisement. Is it working? No. What did I do wrong? Okay. So, in terms of how the city was laid out, of course, there are two main issues where, if you talk about two cities, divided by river. That's one way to look at it as two different cities, right? So there was the north side of the river and the south. What did I do? The north side of the city and the south side of the city. And of course, today, Gangnam and Gangbuk is divided by the Han River. But in fact, originally it was not the Han River, but the Daejeon, I guess you could call it a river or a creek or a stream. How do we translate it?
Stream.
Stream. Yeah, it depends on the season, I think. Yeah. It was a beautiful stream, and it was very appealing at the time when Seoul was started. But by the 18th century, it was not so appealing, and it had to be dredged repeatedly for filling up with silt, and people threw a lot of garbage in it, etc. But the city was divided along that stream, and that's where we got the sort of the north village and the south village, right? Bukchon, Namchon, along this dividing river. It's interesting thing about Seoul also that we say villages, right? That there's a Bukchon, Namchon, there used to be a Chungchon, Sochon, because that's quite different. I mean, other cities are not villages, right? So Seoul is very distinctive in that it has relatively low-level buildings until the 20th century, and it is arranged as villages. The northern village tended to be the more elite Yangban aristocrats and people closer, the further you got up closer to the government, to the palace, and the south tended, as a general rule, to be the middle people, the Chungin artisans, etc., going down to the south. So already it was two cities. I'm suggesting various different ways you can break it into two cities, but in the Chosun it was split in that respect already. This is, of course, the classical Chungdaejeon. This is from the main street going down. This is not as it looks today, as it looks at the Seoul History Museum. Going down with the ministries on either side, which is, to some degree, still the pattern we see today. So then, another issue about this tale of the two cities. And this, of course, in the 18th century, the famous struggle between King Yeongjo and his son, Prince Sado. You probably all know the story, but basically, Prince Sado and Yeongjo had, actually, it's not an easy story because even people don't agree on actually what happened. Everything. And there was a recent movie which came out, which I saw, came out last year, I believe. about Sado, which I thought was particularly biased against Sado myself, but I'm a Sado idealist. Follow Sado. But anyway, they had profound differences between the two individuals and between the bureaucratic groups that backed the prince and the king. And ultimately, Sado was accused of being mentally ill and having killed people in the palace. And King Yeongjo, or people around Yeongjo, determined that he should be gotten rid of in a very drastic way. As opposed to being banished or put in exile or put under house arrest, he was put into a rice box, was it? A chest, rice chest, and left there essentially to die of dehydration. Anyway, one of the points about this conflict between the two has a lot to do with the two cities. So one of the big sins of Prince Sado in the eyes of the bureaucrats and the eyes of King Yeongjo too. It's hard to distinguish between bureaucrats and kings, since they, kings only represent themselves usually through bureaucrats. But his sin was that he both left the palace to go have fun with commoners and assorted, dancers, other people outside of the palace, and something even greater sin, he smuggled these people into the palace to have fun on the inside. So he was someone who sort of jumped over some of these walls that separated the two different cities of Seoul. Now, the most famous example of this is what's called I just looked on the internet to get these pictures, so I don't know if they're the best, but what's called the Kimakol, of these back alley. This is, of course, Chungnam, the main boulevard in front of the palace. But there were these back alleys in the period where people, Koreans, commoners particularly enjoyed, because if you walked along the main boulevard, if a yanban, a high-status person came, you're supposed to bow and be obsequious. But if you were in the back places, you were much more at ease. And so very much the culture, the two cities of Seoul, palaces, and then the back alleys where all the fun was. Okay, so the Gangbuk Palace was burned down by the Japanese, and in fact, it was not really reconstructed until the Grand Archduke Hongzong, who went about this restoration, I think very much inspired by the Tongzhi restoration in China, to try and make Korea a powerful country again by restoring the great palace from the beginning. And when he did that, it was the beginning of the efforts to reform and recreate a new Seoul. He did it in a somewhat conservative tone or chord, but he set I think the direction which you would then later get under King Kojong, who tried to make a new city, essentially, and developed, both introducing various different aspects of Western culture, Doksugung, sort of complex combinations, his famous tea house where he used to sit, slightly Russian-style tea house where he sat and talked to various diplomats over coffee, trying to figure out a way to save Korea. So I'm going to go through these maybe a little bit more quickly because I want to get to the rest of it. But there you've got the international people like us started flowing into Seoul at this time, seeking out opportunities. And there are some people have noted some interesting parallels between how Seoul functions and the challenges that Korea faces today, as similar to what was, say, true 100 years ago. And of course, in the Kojong, creating the altar to heaven, which was something, of course, that had not been allowed. You had the San, the Jig altars, but the altar to heaven was only something in the Ming Dynasty in China. And to some degree, I guess they recognized the Qing as well. But trying to make, with the building of the altar to heaven, that Korea had this sort of authority, and they started calling it an empire, as this sort of recreation. So everything changed in terms of the two cities with the Japanese colonial occupation. And the important point, of course, is the flipping of the two cities, right? So the north used to be the most elite area where you'd want to live, where the Yangban inhabited, and the south was the sort of middle class or the artisans, and the far south, of course, when you get down to Namsan, includes some elite people had their villas or places to have fun. But in the colonial period, the Japanese decided that the south side, the southern side of the Chungnam Creek, would be the center. And so that area was electrified. You've got all these new modern buildings, high theaters, movie theaters, department buildings, mitsukoshi, and the north side, which had originally been the north side of the creek, was then the last to be electrified, and increasingly more and more run down and less appealing. So that was, again, another sort of twist to this story of the two cities. Then there were specific steps taken in that process, building the Japanese Governor General's office right in front of the Gangbuk to first block the flow of the chi down from the mountain, but also sort of definitively redefine the city. City Hall also, which is a very interesting sort of example. In fact, I think City Hall today is itself representative of the two cities. It's like there are two cities in Seoul, so you need two city halls, right? The one being the old colonial style city hall from the Japanese period, and the second, better known as the tsunami, built under Oseun, which is this wave of glass which looks like it's about to wash away the old city hall. The old city hall, of course, now is a library and sort of cultural space. Nice building, has a nice cafe on the top if you ever get up there. And actually, just a little footnote about the city hall. One of the things most fascinating about it is if you go to the top floor, there's an exhibition about has all the mayors of Seoul, but it starts in 1950. Which I can't understand. There were mayors of Seoul from the 14th century, but for some reason they seem to think that they only have mayors in Seoul starting in the 1950s. So I was going to write a column about that. I just haven't written it yet. But anyway, sorry, I get off the track. And of course the city was surrounded by a wall. It's a really interesting thing. The wall, of course, was meant to be defensive and also unifying and had, of course, a political significance to it. And in some respects, I think the interesting thing about the Japanese period and the remodeling of the city was that the wall itself was torn down, large sections of it, but within the city itself, walls went up. So you got the city itself was split up. More and more houses were built with like big walls around them, a lot of colonial period houses, which was actually quite different than the way Seoul had been in the Chosun period, when there actually most of the city houses were not separated by big brick walls. And particularly, the pieces of the wall was from the Korean, the Shinto shrine, which was they took an enormous piece of the wall out to make this as part of the integration of Korea into Japan. And then the south, particularly what's known as Honmachi, became the sort of the place where everybody went to find modernity. The modern boys and the modern girls who dressed up and wore makeup or Western-style clothes flocked to that other part. And particularly important, there's a famous Joseon exhibition in 1929 in which I think was very significant because there was a clear effort by the Japanese to take the political out of Seoul. Seoul became like a museum or a park or like Disneyland. And that was very intentional to try and sort of take like the Saji, this very famous story, the Sa and the Ji altars, right, which were the center of political power in Korea and affirmed the relationship of the king to the people, but it was made into the Sajik Park, right, where you could take your baby in a baby stroller, or go for a walk with your dog. And in fact, it was only a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that they finally stopped calling it the Sajik Park, and it's now the Sajik Altar, the Sajik. They call it Sajik Altar, but in fact it's altars, it's 2 altars. Anyway, so then what happened after the war? Well, the 2 cities shift again. The Cheonggyecheon, of course, is a place where these makeshift houses spring up, and it comes to represent, for many Koreans, very emotionally and also in an olfactory sense, because it was so polluted and so wretched and fetid. It represented the worst of what had happened to Korea in the Korean War, and the humiliation and pain of that period, and the very, very terrible poverty of the people who set up these houses along the creek. But obviously profoundly different meaning to the creek than had been the case before. And that led to the next stage in the Tale of 2 Cities, which was totally modernizing Seoul. The most famous person in that was Mayor Kim Hyun-ok, who never saw a bulldozer he didn't like, and who set out to flatten things out and build all sorts of, the most famous example is, of course, the Cheonggyecheon, which became like this. And this is what it looked like, more or less, the first time I ever came to Korea, where it was put underground became a sewer, and over it was an overpass was built. Now, maybe many of you know this because you've been here much longer than I have. But it was a profound transformation, and in a way, the city, the creek, the river which had defined the 2 cities, disappeared. When it disappeared, it was replaced by another river, the Han River. The whole thing moved, and again, like was the case for the colonial period, the southern part was then emphasized. So the balance shifted to the south with the development of Gangnam. As you may have noticed, in recent years, in the last 3 or 4 years, it's shifted back again, right? With now the north and the Pukchon area becoming popular again. But there was a shift again, and yet another sort of dynamic of 2 cities emerged. Yeouido, of course, being part of that process, but more importantly, the Hyundai apartments and this sort of by fiat decision, not unlike Lee Sung-gae and Cheongdo-jeon's founding of the original Seoul, to decide to create this new space. This is from the very beginning when they were still farming, famous picture, farming with oxen out there while these modern apartments were going up. And a whole new Seoul, a whole new city was thereby created. And specifically, policies was the moving of the major high schools to the south, accompanied by, of course, the moving of Seoul National University. So the last 3 mayors, which is within the range of my short memory, Emanuel, famous for his work on Cheonggyecheon, which he publicized to no end, and of course loved to redevelop things as well in his own unique style. Very interested in making Seoul into an international city. Cheonggyecheon, of course, I think in its beginning was very complicated. I mean, on the one hand, it was great that it was opened up, was no longer covered, but of course it was all, no green, right? And in fact, to this day, it doesn't flow down from the mountains, right? It just comes gurgling up out of the sewers. But now it has fish in it, which it didn't have at first, and there's increasingly more green. And then Mayor Oh Se-hoon, who's running for office right now here, had this idea of design and creating a city. He said, all that matters is design, which I think meant he was very much interested in sort of expensive design, fashion design. And he built this in, as you know, the famous DDP, the spaceship which landed in the middle of Seoul, and is a very, well, in some ways controversial, very interesting space actually, DDP, I think, is increasingly being claimed because young people have gone there and created their own DDP culture, which I think Oh Se-hoon had no idea about. And so it's taking off and becoming a more and more interesting space, in fact. And then Park Won-soon, the man who would be mayor, who suddenly appeared, and his slogan is "You are the mayor." I'm not really sure what that means, but the participatory, and particularly his footnote, his signature was Citizens Hall, the Shiminchang, in the basement of City Hall, which was this very participatory. They have a weekend market there, and there are a lot of activities. I've done several seminars there. I happen to be very fond of that space. Okay, so that's the beginning. So let's look at what there is. So of course, Gangnam, I don't have to tell you what Gangnam style is. It's now become universally known. Rodeo Drive, a lot of space between buildings, hard to get around without a car, and a very distinctive sort of design. Very, very different, obviously, from the Gangbuk, from the north. And also, of course, Gangnam, as you probably know, is swampland, right? High water. They have many of the major buildings have 24-hour pumps going to try and get all the water out from them. So it was actually an area which was really never meant to be built on, and was much better as fields and orchards as it was before. But one of the interesting things about the Gangbuk, if you think of Gangbuk as being the north as being the smaller streets and avenues and the more personal scale, and Gangnam being like Rodeo Drive, within Gangnam itself, you get things like KORUS, which are like a sort of like a little Gangbuk inside of Gangnam. And some people made an interesting point, which is, I think, fascinating comparison. If you compare Hongdae, a area of Hongdae with KORUS is more like Gangbuk than Hongdae, which is becoming increasingly Gangnam style. So there is these complexity in recent days, in which, and also, as you know, like with the Gyeonggi-gun, with the Gyeonggi-gun-zai, the new apartment buildings which are being put up, there's a lot of Gangnam style developments now going on in the north. So the distinction between the two cities in their modern form has become much more complex. Gangnam style specifically has been very much a part of this new cultural vitality. Of course, Psy gave this enormous concert with over 80,000 people, and there has been this sort of spontaneous sort of coming together in the culture, young people's culture in Seoul, which has been very attractive. And then there are lots of things in the Gangbuk style. I think Misang, which actually I knew it only as a cartoon, unbeknownst to me, until people started writing me, because I don't really watch TV. Most people abroad know it from the TV drama, which is now around the world. I have on my blog, I had a description of the Misang, the comic book, and it was actually, I got more hits for that than anything I've ever written, for some reason. I think because people all over the world wanted to know about Misang, and there's nothing in English. So, but anyway, it's a very interesting story, and it's a tale of two cities, right? The Misang itself, right? Talking about the Gangnam offices for major corporations, and the sort of class social distinctions between those who live in Gangnam and those who are in Gangbuk or places like Gangbuk, who commute into work in the companies, and how the two different aspects of the city interact in the same space. And of course, it's also set out, it's like a Padu Go structure, and the whole relations within the company and within the city are compared to the game of chess in a way. And then in terms of cities, in terms of K-pop, do I have any time left? I still have time, okay. I don't want to bore people with all these unimportant details, but Korea has developed an enormous popular music culture. I'm not expert. I consult with my daughter about these things when I need to know. But the interesting thing about the major companies is that they took the sort of like community, right? SM town, YJ family, JYP nation, tried to create communities. And if I had to say a distinctive aspect of Korea is the need or the desire to form communities. That there's this sort of what you call Mao, or village mentality, and that even in Gangnam, as people try and escape and create this modern, somewhat, God forbid, American style of life, there's still this profound desire to form a community even within that new world. And then, of course, there's the whole academy world for people who want to become singers, which has emerged in it. On the north side, you have the Hongdae. There used to be about 10, 15 years. I've actually never been to drug, or I have interviewed some people from bands, like Find the Spot, because when I was trying to write the book. But there's a whole world out there, of course, in Hongdae of this sort of indie punk experimental music, which is quite different in its content than what you find in Gangnam. In terms of Cheonggyecheon itself today, it's an evolving work. I'm very pleased to say it's increasingly green, getting closer and closer to being like it was originally. But if you walk in, as I've done several times, from the beginning, from the in front of Gyeonggi all the way to the Gangnam, to the river, to the Hangang River, it gets dirtier as you go along, so it's not perfect. But it is a very interesting space, includes galleries and sort of cultural spaces, and increasingly it's the place where people go, particularly foreigners, but not just foreigners, young people, to create their own sort of a culture there. It's also, of course, a center for both performance, for festivals, and, of course, protest. Of course, right there at the very beginning, right in front of Gwanmun, is the space where we have from the Seoul ferry sinking, the constant protest has become a community. I think it's now been there for almost 2 years, and for student and labor protests. But there are also festivals, music events, very much a part of this space, which I think is, in a way, intersection of the two cities. Places for they make signs and metalwork, and most interesting of all is there's been a lot of fusion between artists, sculptors who work with local stores to create sculptures, and of course a lot of artists who bought spaces there, and many creative people, full-time artists, love to walk around in these areas, like around Ujo Samga in the back lanes. It's actually one of my favorite places in Seoul. But it clearly is another part, another city from what you see, say, here. So you get this sort of like mainstream, very clean, tourist-oriented, and then you go back, you walk out, you find actually the more interesting other city around it. In terms of what happened with Cheonggyecheon in its redevelopment under Mayor Lee Myung-bak, it went two different directions. There were some people, of course, many people displaced. It was quite disruptive. Some, like the Dongmyo flea market, has been extremely successful. People have been very innovative in finding new ways to sell their works. But there were a large number of people who were given spaces in this new department store complex called Garden 5 at Gwangju, which is basically a ghost town. As part of my research, I went there and actually saw where these people have been relocated. We used to have stores along the Cheonggyecheon, and there's literally nobody there. They were given certain benefits, and they still run their stores, but it's a distinctive space. On the Han River, of course, has become increasingly, has its own culture. Everything from romantic places that are portrayed in media, suicide culture. There's, on the Banto Daejeon, there are these signs trying to encourage people not to jump off. Something says, "Did you eat?" Sort of a friendly comment to the person who's sitting there thinking about whether to jump in the river. And it also has its own sort of living and evolving culture. Markets. Seoul's defining characteristic, I think, is its markets. There are some very interesting ones, traditional markets, like the Kyung traditional markets for Oriental medicines, many of which have a very, very old history. You've probably been around all these markets already, like Gwangju. Each person has their own space, their own goods. Often, as you know, in Korea, people tend to clump together, right? Like all the pet stores are all in the same area. I still can't understand it. But that's the way things tend to work in Korea. Some of the more creative efforts in terms of revitalizing the markets, like the Tongin, which they use special currency, and they've made I think, a very attractive design and tried to revitalize it as a space. And it's gotten, I think, more and more people who have gone there. My children happen to be fond of it. I think the Dongjin is probably one of the more creative ones, in which you have a combination between artists who created their own displays, combined with, while retaining many of the original stores that were there at the beginning. And it's, in a way, the two cities come together in a very effective way in the case of the Dongjin market and Yeonnam-dong. And another example is Chungnam, which is similar. An effort, a very conscious, I think quite successful effort to keep traditional market stalls, and also in the basement they have all these spaces for creative artists to express themselves, to create works of art. You have these examples like this. I took this picture of one of the women there, and the artists that work there have made a little picture of her, and they've done these illustrations for the various creative people who actually have the old stalls for the last 20, 30, 40 years. My understanding, in case from my interview, people in Chungnam, originally there was a lot of skepticism from the people who worked there about these artists coming in, but over the last 3 or 4 years, they've come to have quite a good working relationship between the two. And they have a lot of festivals there, which I have attended several of, in which they come together. You see this one, the artists created these, they took the smocks that the people vending fish use, and they drew sort of interesting art on them and suspended them above to create a very unique sort of a cultural space. So back to Gangnam. So Gangnam also creates its own villages. Department stores like Hyundai Department Store are villages in themselves, and you can see a real desire. They include art, culture, places to eat, parks, and the sort of exhibitions of art, trying to become, in a way, the department store as a self-contained village. But of course, it doesn't really work as a village because it's all owned by the same company. But there is this desire for a village, which I think is deeply ingrained in the Korean culture. And then, of course, Zaha Lee's UFO, the Dongdaemun, the DDP, which is a really interesting space. And as I mentioned before, I've been very interested in the way that young people go there and are creating their own sort of culture around it. Although they have some limits or rules about skateboards and things, so you can't get too carried away. But there's a whole sort of young people's culture that's emerged around DDP recently. Also in the north side of the city, the Gangbuk, there's been enormous proliferation of murals, efforts by artists like Kyung is a very active animator, and he's done all these murals in his neighborhood to sort of create a new space for it. Very, very effective. And there have been many of these sorts of efforts in the various different sort of small neighborhoods, Inhwa or Gamey, or for that matter in Hwegi, where Kyungi is as well. These mural projects, often extremely creative. However, the response to them has sometimes been rather complex. There have been a lot of protests from local people against it, fear, of course, gentrification, which killed Pukchon, as you know, and the fear that art can work, in a sense, if you can keep a balance between the two cities, but often it tends to go off the deep end, in which case the people who were there originally, like Insadong, here, this is the ground zero for that sort of transformation. I remember what Inside Bone was like when I first came for 1 year in 1995 as a visiting student, and it's quite different, obviously, today. And then, of course, there are the cities, the cats, their own private life. I haven't been able to put a camera on a cat yet, but I'm sure they could show us a whole other city. But there are a lot of very interesting new gardens and efforts. City Hall, the new Citizens Hall, I think is particularly unique in that respect. It's one of my favorite spaces, in fact, in Seoul. And it's an effort, I think, to revive the sort of traditional market-oriented space, but within a modern building. So it's within what the sort of Gangnam style, Osehun's new City Hall, but it's sort of harking back to sort of the village life. And then there are also efforts to create new spaces, the Haja Center for youth, places that the city, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, has made considerable efforts. And of course, Gangnam, the complexes, which are going up everywhere. Maybe the most striking contrast to the two cities is Messenopolis. So this is an enormous development in Hapjeong, and it's very interesting to contrast it, Messenopolis, with the Han River project. Didn't really work out, the Daejeon project. So compare it with Seongnisan. So the two, I'm sorry to flip around. So this complex, big, one plan, one company essentially put it together, and just a few blocks away from it, you have Seongnisan, which was an effort by a local community originally protesting the efforts in Seongni Mountain of the city to build a reservoir. And out of that protest, they built this sort of village movement. They founded their own alternative school, the Seongnisan School, which is an excellent alternative school. And I wanted to send my kids there, but my wife didn't want to. Anyway, I'm very, very fond of giving several lectures at Seongnisan Hakyo, and they do some of the most innovative classes in terms of emphasizing ecosystems and nature and farming. There's a program at Seongnisan Alternative School now where I think kids in 7th grade go for 1 semester to the countryside and they farm as part of their learning process. And from their very beginning, from like kindergarten, they learn how to plant and take care of plants or crops. On the other hand, if you wanted to contrast, my book, by the way, is a contrast between these different places. So like Seongnisan on the one hand, and the other one would be, of course, Lotte World Mall, which you've probably seen. It's hard not to see it. This is an enormous structure, which very, very, I would say, indulgent, assuming increasingly focused on Chinese tourists and wealthy individuals coming in. And it is very much cut off from the world around it. However, within Lotte World Mall, there's a whole area in which these traditional style restaurants that look like they came out of Korea in 1970 are in a line. So they actually, even within Lotte World Mall, there's this effort to recreate the Gangbuk world. Lotte World Mall, you should see it yourself. Truly unique space. And then, of course, there's a lot of controversy between the two cities, the most famous being Yongsan redevelopment, there's a whole series of comic books describing the conflicts and what happened to the local people, and of course, the deaths as a result when the protesters got into a fight with the police, and the kerosene they had been used for, they had stockpiled, caught on fire. And there are spaces, because conflicts between rich and poor, maybe the most outstanding being the Kudong Mao controversy, which has been resolved. Unfortunately, I had a chance to interview a woman who had organized a lot of cultural activities in Kudong, which was a very poor, working class, small village across from a major development, expensive apartments, and there was, of course, a redevelopment plan, and they were fighting against being thrown out, although they ultimately lost that battle. But there were several artists who went there to try and create artistic events and other theater to sort of highlight the culture of Kudong. Education, Hagwon, of course, another part of Seoul. This is a sort of a general overview of what Seoul is like today. There are different worlds that people live in. If you're going to school, you live a different world. If you're in Norangjin or Daejeon, you have your own series. They have their own sort of world. There are like these places that offer food for the students. They can eat quickly and cheaply and get back to studying as part of that world. Let's see, what's I was talking about? Student activities. Innovative schools. So in addition to Seonggi-san, I worked a bit with Seonggi-san and was Samgak-san school. These are some very, very innovative schools, very much different than the Hagwon track. So Seoul, is that me? No. Seoul is very interesting in that it's both the extremes of competitive, very commercialized education, based on trying to get into the best school you can, and some of the very, like Seonggi-san, some of the most interesting, innovative alternative schools as well. And then, of course, there's the new industrial revolution, plastic surgery, and the manufacturing people's faces, which is, of course, very much at the center of Gangnam and that new culture. Hard to imagine, and so completely alien, I think, to traditional Korean culture. So I have gone on too long. I will stop here. So I just laid out some basic ideas of my work in progress, and I very much look forward to hearing your own thoughts about the different two cities that compete, and through their competition, I think, create the dynamism that makes Seoul what it is. If I can contrast, say, Seoul with a city like Tokyo, which I lived for many years, I think there is this sort of tension between these two cities, these two sort of imagined urban spaces, and that tension is both a source of conflict, as we see in, say, Yongsan redevelopment, but it's also, I think, the essence of the vitality, the tension and the vitality that makes Seoul such a unique city. Thank you.
So, any questions?
I have a question. Yeah, actually, it's my opinion about the Seoul City building. I'm talking about the aerial trade, Gangbuk and Gangnam area. Gangbuk area, the central government offices are located traditionally from 14th century onward, and Gangnam area was just more or less 55 years ago was it's a rural area. There was I was there when I was at age 6 or 7. I was there. There was paddy fields and public cemetery and the rural village, and the forests are prevalent there. And there's no urban economy at all. It's completely is a rural area. It was a rural village, and that was the central urban economy has changed the rural area of Gangnam into CBD, Central Business District. Now it's Gangnam style. Yeah? The rural village, at the time is called Maljukgori. Maljukgori is today Yangjae-dong jurisdictionally, Yangjae-dong, and the Yangjae-dong was a complete rural village just 50 years ago, and where the public cemetery and the rural village and paddy fields are prevalent there all over the ground. And now it's a complete change. That is happened. Gangnam area is completely changed within about 50 years, about 50 years into urban economy.
Right. Fascinating. Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments or?
Thank you, Professor Pastreich, for the visual explanation of the transformation of the two or several parts of Seoul. But between the development and redevelopment, and then going into fashion, once again, there is a kind of some brief moments, or maybe a lengthy period of time, which we call gentrification.
Right, right.
So maybe it would be more interesting to focus on those periods which brings up some agony of the neighborhood and the soul lives. Thank you.
Right, right. Thank you. In fact, I did interview some people living in areas like, say, in Buksan, who had run small stores, you know, for 20, 30 years, and many of them felt it was terrible for them. Right? You know, the price of real estate went up, but for people trying to run little stores, of course, they found economically it was overall worse for them, and it's a whole tale. But I haven't finished this story. It's just the beginning, and I do appreciate that point.